I want to start at the beginning because every system, whether it's a rocket, a business, or a relationship, fails or succeeds based on its first assumptions. And my search for a future wife didn't start with bad intentions. It started with a bad assumption, a toxic lie that sounded reasonable, even intelligent at the time. The lie was this: if I optimize hard enough, status, money, confidence, leverage, I will be able to choose the right woman and love will follow. On the surface, that sounds logical. We live in a world that rewards optimization. Better inputs lead to better outputs. Work harder, earn more. Improve yourself, and your options expand. That logic works in engineering. It works in economics. It even works in fitness. So it felt rational to apply it to relationships. But here's the problem. Human beings are not markets, and love is not an outcome you extract from leverage. I didn't believe I was being manipulative. I believed I was being strategic. I thought I was taking responsibility for my future by becoming high value, by making myself desirable enough that I could avoid pain, avoid rejection, avoid choosing wrong. Underneath it all was fear, the fear of vulnerability dressed up as discipline and ambition. Psychologically, this lie is seductive because it gives you control. It tells you that if something fails, you just didn't optimize enough. You weren't attractive enough, successful enough, confident enough. And that's comforting in a strange way, because it means you never have to confront uncertainty or emotional risk. You just keep upgrading the system. But philosophically, the lie is deeply flawed. It reduces love to a transaction and turns another human being into a variable in your personal success equation. It shifts the question from who can I grow with to who qualifies. And once you start thinking that way, you stop listening, you stop seeing, you stop relating. What made this lie especially dangerous is that it's reinforced everywhere. Social media frames relationships as status symbols. Dating advice often treats women as puzzles to solve or rewards to unlock. Even self-improvement culture, which has real value, can quietly mutate into narcissism if it's not grounded in humility. So I absorbed the idea that becoming a better man was primarily about becoming more impressive, not more honest, more dominant, not more grounded, more desirable, not more emotionally available. And I didn't question it because it worked on paper. I got attention, I got options, I got validation. But internally, something was off. The connections felt thin. Conversation stayed on the surface. I was evaluating instead of engaging, protecting instead of opening. And worst of all, I started to believe that if a woman didn't fit my optimized vision of the future, she was a liability rather than a person. That's the quiet damage of this lie. It doesn't make you cruel. It makes you disconnected. You become efficient at dating and terrible at intimacy. At a deeper level, the lie assumes that the purpose of a wife is to complete your life design, rather than to challenge it. It assumes marriage is a reward for success, not a partnership that transforms you. And that mindset sets you up for failure, because the moment reality pushes back, and it always does, you blame the person instead of the premise. Looking back, I can see that this lie didn't start with women at all. It started with how I related to myself. I believed my worth was conditional, earned, proven. So of course I approached love the same way. I was trying to secure certainty in a domain that fundamentally requires trust. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot engineer your way out of emotional risk. You can delay it, you can disguise it, but you can't remove it. The cost of pretending you can is a slow erosion of authenticity. The irony is that the lie promised clarity and control, but delivered confusion and distance. It made me busier, not wiser, louder, not deeper. And until I questioned that first assumption, until I admitted that love isn't optimized, it's revealed, I couldn't move forward. Because the search for a future wife doesn't begin with becoming impressive enough to choose correctly. It begins with becoming honest enough to see clearly. Once I accepted the lie, the downstream effects were predictable, even if I didn't recognize them at the time. Bad assumptions don't stay theoretical, they express themselves in behavior. And in my case, that lie quietly corrupted how I dated, how I evaluated women, and how I showed up in relationships. The first distortion was expectation. If you believe love is the result of optimization, you start expecting outcomes instead of experiences. You expect chemistry on demand, alignment without friction, admiration without effort. And when those expectations aren't met, you don't get curious, you get disappointed. Not because something is wrong, but because reality refuses to obey your model. So I began approaching dating like a filtering process. Who fits my future? Who doesn't slow me down? Who checks the boxes? It sounds efficient, but it subtly dehumanizes everyone involved. When you're filtering, you're not connecting. You're comparing. You're scanning for utility, not truth. Psychologically, this creates distance. You're present but guarded. Engaged but not invested. You ask questions, but you're really listening for confirmation of your assumptions. And when someone shows complexity, emotional needs, uncertainty, imperfections, you experience it as noise in the system rather than data worth understanding. The second distortion was how I interpreted red flags. Some red flags I exaggerated, others I ignored completely. If a woman challenged me emotionally, I labeled her difficult. If she didn't, I labeled her easygoing, even if that ease was actually emotional avoidance mirroring my own. The lie trained me to prefer comfort over depth, predictability over growth. And that's dangerous, because intimacy isn't built on comfort. It's built on the ability to stay present when things get uncomfortable. But my framework rewarded smoothness, not substance. So I avoided necessary conversations. I delayed honesty. I chose chemistry over character and control over courage. There was also a subtler cost. I stopped being fully myself. When you're trying to maintain leverage, you don't reveal uncertainty. You don't admit fear. You don't say, I don't know. You perform competence. And over time, that performance becomes exhausting, not just for you, but for the other person who can feel the wall even if they can't name it. Philosophically, the lie placed me in the center of the universe. Everything revolved around my timeline, my goals, my readiness. The woman across from me became an accessory to my future, rather than a co-author of it. That orientation makes mutuality impossible. You can't build us if you're always optimizing for me. What's ironic is that I thought I was protecting myself from pain. In reality, I was guaranteeing a different kind of pain, the slow burn of shallow connection, the kind where nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels deeply right either, the kind where you're never fully rejected but never fully known. And the more this pattern repeated, the more it reinforced itself. Each failed connection became evidence that I needed to optimize more, improve further, raise standards, tighten filters. The lie fed on its own consequences. Instead of questioning the premise, I doubled down on the strategy. This is how intelligent people get trapped, not by stupidity, but by flawed logic applied consistently. Over time, something else crept in, resentment, quiet, unspoken resentment. I resented women for not fitting the model. I resented myself for feeling unsatisfied despite doing everything right. And resentment is a signal. It tells you there's a mismatch between what you're pursuing and what actually matters. At its core, the lie prevented responsibility of a deeper kind. Not responsibility for outcomes, but responsibility for presence, for emotional availability, for creating safety rather than leverage, for asking not what can I get, but what am I willing to give consistently when it's inconvenient. Eventually, I had to face a hard realization. I wasn't failing to find the right woman. I was succeeding at avoiding the kind of relationship that would force me to grow. That's the real cost of the lie. It doesn't just sabotage your search for love. It protects you from transformation. And if you're honest with yourself, the question becomes unavoidable. Are you optimizing to win at dating, or are you willing to risk losing the version of yourself that no longer serves you? The lie didn't collapse all at once. It fractured, slowly at first, then suddenly. That's usually how flawed models fail, not in dramatic explosions, but in accumulating anomalies you can't explain away anymore. For me, the first crack appeared in a moment that should have felt like success. I was with someone who, by my own criteria, checked nearly every box. Intelligent, attractive, aligned with my lifestyle, low friction. On paper, it made sense. And yet, sitting across from her, I felt an unexpected emptiness, not boredom, not dissatisfaction, but a strange sense of absence, as if something essential was missing from the equation. At first, I assumed the problem was external. Maybe the chemistry wasn't strong enough. Maybe I needed more time. Maybe this was just how mature relationships felt. Calmer, less intense. So I tried to rationalize the discomfort, but the signal persisted. The real turning point came when she asked me a simple question. What actually scares you about being close to someone? It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't emotional, it was calm, almost clinical. And I didn't have an answer, not because I didn't want to respond, but because I had never allowed myself to think in those terms. I had optimized so thoroughly around avoiding fear that I'd never examined it directly. That silence told me more than any argument could have. It exposed the gap between who I presented myself to be and what I was actually prepared to offer, psychologically. That was the moment cognitive dissonance became unavoidable. My self-image was that of a disciplined, self-aware man building toward a meaningful future. But my behavior revealed someone deeply uncomfortable with emotional exposure. Someone fluent in strategy, but inexperienced in surrender. Once you see that gap, you can't unsee it. After that conversation, Patterns I'd ignored came into focus. I saw how often I kept conversations abstract instead of personal, how quickly I redirected when emotions surfaced, how I framed independence as strength when it was often just avoidance with better branding. Philosophically, I had to confront something even more unsettling. I had mistaken control for wisdom. I believed that by managing variables, timing, options, standards, I could bypass the inherent uncertainty of intimacy. But intimacy is not a problem to solve. It's a condition you enter, and it demands a different kind of intelligence. There was no dramatic breakup, no betrayal, no catastrophic failure, just a quiet realization that the model I was using could never produce the outcome I claimed to want. I wasn't failing because I lacked information or effort. I was failing because the premise itself was wrong. The lie fell apart fully when I asked myself a harder question than what do I want? I asked, what kind of relationship would force me to become someone better, not more impressive, but more honest? And the answer was uncomfortable. It wasn't a relationship where I had the upper hand. It wasn't one where I felt invulnerable. It wasn't one that fit neatly into a 5-year plan. It was one where I would have to be seen before I was certain, chosen without guarantees, known in ways I couldn't control. That realization triggered a kind of grief, not for any particular person, but for the version of myself I had invested in. The optimized, protected, always in control version. Letting go of the lie meant letting go of the identity built around it. And that's why people cling to bad assumptions long after they stop working. They're not just ideas, they're shelters. But clarity has momentum. Once the lie collapsed, it took others with it. I could no longer pretend that becoming high value was the same as becoming ready for partnership. I could no longer confuse attention with connection or options with intimacy. I began to see that the discomfort I'd been avoiding wasn't a warning sign. It was the entry point. Growth doesn't announce itself as confidence. It shows up as exposure, as not knowing, as the willingness to stay when you can't predict the outcome. The wake-up call wasn't loud. It didn't come from failure. It came from honesty, from realizing that the thing I was most afraid of, being emotionally unarmored, was the very thing my future required. And once that clicked, the path forward became obvious, even if it wasn't easy. Because when a lie falls apart, it doesn't just free you from what's false, it confronts you with what's necessary. Once the lie was gone, I expected clarity to feel empowering. Instead, it felt disorienting. Because when you strip away a flawed framework, you don't immediately get a better one. You get responsibility. And responsibility, unlike optimization, can't be outsourced to tactics or timelines. What became obvious is that the question I had been asking was backwards. I wasn't supposed to be asking how to find the right wife. I was supposed to be asking how to become a husband. That shift sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Becoming a husband isn't about achieving a certain level of success or confidence. It's about developing the capacity to stay present when things are uncertain, uncomfortable, or emotionally costly. It's about learning to regulate yourself instead of managing others. And that requires internal work. Most people postpone indefinitely. Psychologically, I had to confront my relationship with discomfort. I realized that I had built an identity around competence, being capable, prepared, ahead of the curve. That identity works well in competitive environments. It fails in intimate ones. Relationships don't reward the person who needs to be right. They reward the person who can repair, listen, and adapt without collapsing into defensiveness. So the work became less about attraction and more about nervous system stability. Could I sit with another person's emotions without needing to fix them? Could I express needs without framing them as ultimatums? Could I tolerate ambiguity without reaching for control? These aren't romantic questions. They're practical ones. And they determine whether a marriage compounds or corrodes over time. Philosophically, I had to abandon the idea that marriage is something you earn after you become complete. That idea assumes wholeness precedes partnership. In reality, partnership is often the environment where wholeness is developed. Not because your partner fixes you, but because the relationship exposes the parts of you that still need work. That reframing changed how I viewed conflict. Instead of seeing disagreement as inefficiency or incompatibility, I began to see it as information, a signal pointing to unresolved values, unmet needs, or unexamined assumptions. Conflict stopped being something to avoid and became something to navigate skillfully. It also changed my standards, but not in the way people usually mean. I didn't lower them, I redirected them inward. I became less concerned with finding someone who fit my life perfectly, and more concerned with whether I could be consistent, honest, and resilient enough to build a life with someone over time, because attraction opens the door. Character keeps it open. One of the most important realizations was this: Commitment isn't about certainty, it's about orientation. You don't commit because you're sure nothing will go wrong. You commit because you're willing to face what goes wrong without defaulting to escape, blame, or withdrawal. That's a skill, and like any skill, it can be trained. I started measuring progress differently, not by how many options I had, but by how I handled disappointment. Not by how impressive I appeared, but by how quickly I took responsibility. Not by how much control I felt, but by how much trust I was capable of extending without guarantees. Ironically, this shift made relationships feel lighter, not heavier. When you're no longer performing for leverage, you're free to be precise, clear, and real. You stop auditioning, you start relating, and that changes the energy entirely. What emerged was a quieter confidence, not the confidence of dominance or desirability, but the confidence of alignment, the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle the emotional demands of partnership, not perfectly, but honestly. And that's when the idea of a future wife stopped being a goal and started being a consequence. A consequence of doing the work consistently, privately, without applause. A consequence of becoming someone capable of partnership rather than someone merely qualified for it. The final insight is simple, but it's uncomfortable. The relationship you're seeking will require a version of you that doesn't exist yet, and no amount of strategy can substitute for becoming that person. So the real question isn't, who you're trying to find. It's who you're willing to become when no one is watching.